Good afternoon, and welcome to Research in Action in 2022. My name is Karen Scapinato. I will be today's moderator of the session. With that, it is my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Erika Hoff. Dr. Hoff is professor of psychology at Florida Atlantic University, and her research addresses the relations among properties of children's early environments, their language experience, and their language development. She is funded through the NIH with a longitudinal study on Spanish-English bilingual development, and is also the author of numerous articles and chapters, and is a book editor of multiple books. With that, I'll turn it over to today's speaker, Dr. Erika Hoff, who will talk about bilingual language development in toddlers.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me see, I have to move this so I can see what I am showing you. And this title, Early Dual Language Development in Children from Spanish-Speaking Homes, is the title of a large project that I started, about 15 years ago. And the aims were really pretty simple and straightforward. We wanted to know what the course of bilingual development looks like, and also what factors shape bilingual development. So some children develop differently and more rapidly than others, and we wanted to identify why. So what I'm going to tell you about today is some of the answers, some of the lessons that I think that we have learned from this study. And I describe it as a study of simultaneous Spanish-English bilinguals in the United States. And all of those descriptors are carefully chosen. That is, the children that I'm talking about are children who hear two languages, most of them from the time they are born, all of them before the age of 2. So I'm not talking about children who learn one language and then move to a new country and have to learn another language. I'm talking about children who hear and learn two languages at the same time. Those two languages are Spanish and English, and that may make a difference, particularly the fact that one of their languages is English, and English is just so pervasive in this country and everywhere that becoming bilingual in one language plus English is a different process, or has different influences than becoming bilingual in other pairs of languages. And finally, these children are in the United States. They go to school. Ultimately, they will go to school in English. English is everywhere. If you live in South Florida and you are a monolingual English speaker, you may feel like Spanish is everywhere, but we've studied it. Spanish is not everywhere. English is everywhere. And I will show you the results of that when I show you the data that we've collected. Okay, and this is a description of the first set of families that I studied. We had 56 monolingual English-speaking families for comparison purposes. And then we had 47 families that used both English and Spanish at home, and that's how we recruited them. We advertised for parents who were raising their children to be bilingual in Spanish and English. And here, over here, can you see my arrow as I'm moving it around?
Yes, we can. Yes.
Okay, so this is a very important fact about these two samples. You can see they were both sort of biased towards fairly educated families, but very importantly, the monolingual families and the bilingual families did not differ in their level of education. Much of what is written about bilingual children is written about children from poor families, because immigrant families tend to be bilingual, or the children of immigrant families tend to be bilingual, and immigrant families nationwide and worldwide tend to be overrepresented among families that are living in poverty. But as we probably all know, that's not the case in South Florida. We have a very select group of Spanish-speaking immigrants, and that's a real advantage to this sort of research. It lets me look at what bilingual development looks like without it being tangled up with other issues of poverty. Okay, so we have two groups, two sets of families raising bilingual children. All of them have a child that is 22 months old at the start of this study, and we are visiting them in their homes and testing their English and Spanish development. We are also asking the primary caregivers, which is almost always the mothers, questions about how English and Spanish are used in the home. So here's the next thing I want to tell you about these families. These are data from the 22-month visit. Then we came back when the children were 25 months, and we came back again when the children were 30 months. We asked the mothers how much English and Spanish the children hear at home. And you can see it's pretty balanced. It's exactly balanced, 50-50 at 22 months. The proportion that's English goes up a teeny bit over the course of the study. But as a group, of course, there are differences from household to household, but as a group, these children hear about equal amounts of English and Spanish at home. So now we ask the question, what does their language development look like, given that this is their environment? All right, this blue line, this test, this is a measure of children's language development that works by having parents fill out a form about their children. They check off every word that they've heard their child say. They describe other things about their child's language. It allows us to get information about language development in children that are too young to really sit still for much of a test. So here's the line for the monolingual children. At 22 months, they score 200, which doesn't quite mean they know 200 words, but pretty close to that. So at 22 months, this is their vocabulary level, and it goes up. As we all know, children acquire language and their vocabularies grow. These are the scores. This orange line is the exact same information for the bilingual children's English. So if you compare the blue line to the orange line, that shows you that the children who are learning only one language are ahead of the children who are learning two languages at the same time, if you compare them just on English. And the gray line is the bilingual children's Spanish vocabulary. And there's two reasons to put it here. One I'll tell you now and one I'll tell you later. The reason to tell you this now is to show you that these children, again, as a group, were stronger in English than they were in Spanish. So when I say their English lags behind the English development of the monolingual children, I'm not talking about a group of children who are primarily Spanish speakers. That wouldn't be surprising or interesting. What I'm talking about is children who are really better in English than they are in Spanish, but still their English lags behind the English of monolingual children. And this is a measure of vocabulary. Let me quickly show you that this pattern is not limited to vocabulary. We see it also in this measure of grammar. This particular measure of grammar is how long their sentences are when they speak. And here's another measure of grammar, and this is the age, or this is the proportion of children at each age who are combining words. So when children learn to talk, they first produce one word at a time, and then they start to put two words together, and then three. And typically children start to combine words. Monolingual children start to combine words sometime before their second birthday. And that's exactly what these monolingual children look like. At 22 months, 90% of them are combining words. Not so for the bilingual children, not in English and not in English and not in Spanish. Interestingly, 3 months later, by the time they're 25 months old, the bilingual children have almost caught up. These differences are not statistically meaningful differences. So with this measure, we can say that the bilingual children lag the monolingual children in single language development. And we can also say by how much. That is, the question always is, well, when do they catch up? And the answer to that completely depends upon the measure of language development that you're looking at. But if you're asking when do bilingual children reach this milestone of combining words, it's 3 months later than the monolingual children. Okay, now this blue line is the same blue line you saw before for the vocabulary development of the English monolingual children. Now this orange line is the sum of the bilingual children's English plus Spanish vocabulary. And we, not very imaginatively, call that a measure of total vocabulary. The point of this graph is to show you that the bilingual children look very much like the monolingual children in terms of the rate at which they are learning new words. The difference is the bilingual children's efforts and accomplishments are divided between 2 languages. But if you take the sum total of what the bilingual children are learning, it is not different from what the monolingual children are learning. So being exposed to 2 languages is not confusing these children. They are not sitting there unable to talk at all. They are learning 2 languages. Okay, the next lesson from our studies is that the quantity of language exposure matters. And here's the reason I say that. These should look familiar to you. This is the same blue line you've been looking at for vocabulary development for monolinguals. But now what we've done in this graph is we divided the bilingual children into 3 groups. The orange line is the group of children who hear at least 70% English. So they hear both English and Spanish, but mostly English. This line is the children who hear roughly equal amounts of English and Spanish. And this yellow line is the children who hear mostly Spanish. They hear both languages, but they hear more Spanish than English. And what you can see is these lines just line up in order. This is 100% English in a child's experience. This is at least 70% English in a child's experience. This is around 50%, and this is 30% or less. So you can see the rate at which children learn the vocabulary of a language is very closely tied to the relative amount of that language that they hear in their daily lives. And you can see a similar pattern if you look at a different measure. This measure is, again, the percent of children combining words at each age. And you see the exact same thing for Spanish. That is, the children who are learning less Spanish are learning more English. So here we have the children who hear, we don't have monolingual Spanish speakers in this study. Here are the children who hear mostly Spanish, balanced, and mostly English. And again, the kids who hear mostly Spanish are developing Spanish faster than the kids who hear mostly English, and the same is true for grammar. Okay, so what have I showed you so far? I would claim that I've showed you evidence that monolinguals and bilinguals look similar in terms of total vocabulary achievement, but bilinguals lag monolinguals in terms of single language development. So if you hear people say, oh, bilingualism causes language delays, or if you hear people say bilingualism causes no language delays, they're both right. It just depends upon what your measure of language development is. But if you measure everything a child is learning, the bilingual children are not behind the monolingual children. But of course, if you measure only a part of what they're learning, then they are behind. And this being a little bit behind appears both in vocabulary and grammar at the early ages. I'll give you a sneak preview of data that are to come, but the question people always want to know is, okay, let's say I believe you that the bilingual children are lagging if you look just at one language. Then a very important question is, when do the bilingual children catch up? And as I said before, it depends completely on the measure. If you look at just vocabulary, bilinguals may never catch up. That is, we are all learning vocabulary forever, our whole entire lives. And if all of your learning is in one language, you're always going to have an advantage over people whose learning is divided between 2 languages. But with respect to grammar and many other things about using language to communicate, there sort of is, if not an endpoint, at least an asymptote. We don't get better forever and ever and ever. At some point, we basically know the grammar of our language. And so on those kinds of measures, bilingual children do catch up. They certainly catch up by 9 or 10 years typically. But again, the precise age depends entirely on the measure. And finally, the point I want to make from these data is that we can make a good case for explaining the bilingual lag in terms of the fact that monolinguals get 100% of their language exposure all in the same language, which is kind of weird if you think about it worldwide. Most children hear more than one language. And bilingual children, for them, their language exposure is divided between 2 languages. So they're doing 2 things where the monolingual child is doing only 1. Okay, now we looked at the next activity that my lab engaged in was to try and replicate these findings and extend them to older ages. So I'm going to be talking now about development between the age of 2.5 and 5. And age 5 is where I'm going to end my story today, but of course, it doesn't end for the children and it doesn't end for our lab either, but this is how much we have figured out so far. And in this study, we focused on bilingual children, and we actually have more than 112, but for this particular data analysis, I looked only at children who hear both languages. In this larger study, we have some children who at the age of 2.5 are only hearing Spanish at home. That doesn't last very long, but that was true for some of them. And the monolingual sample is 36 families. And as we tried to get a broader sample of bilingual children, we then have a bilingual sample where the families are less educated than the monolingual sample. And so we statistically control for that in most of the analyses that I'm going to show you. Okay, so that's who we're studying now. This is the same sort of data I showed you before, only now on this new sample. And you can see that this sample is a little bit more Spanish dominant. So English is less than half of what the children hear at home, but not hugely less. And if you go all the way up to 5, you start to see that the amount of English used at home creeps upward. And there's a variety of reasons for that. If you want to hear more, you have to ask a question. Okay. This is what the data tell us about vocabulary development in the monolingual and the bilingual sample from, this graph does it in terms of months, but this is 2.5 years and this is 5 years. And these data points are 6 months apart. We went back and saw the kids in their homes every 6 months, measured lots of things about their English and Spanish development and about their language environments. This particular measure is a measure of vocabulary. This is a test we administered to the children. Now that they're older, we show them a book of pictures and we say, can you tell me what this is called? Can you tell me what this is called? So we're measuring what's called their expressive vocabulary knowledge. And we see pretty much the same finding we saw before. The monolingual children are more advanced than the bilingual children when we look just at English. Now, there's one thing you see in this graph that you didn't see at the earlier age. These 2 lines are parallel. That is, the monolinguals are more advanced, but they're not gaining. And in fact, if you take the bilinguals and divide them into the more advanced and the less advanced kids, you see that the children who are really low in English at 2.5 are acquiring English faster than the children who are more advanced at 2.5. So you do see catch up already in this age period. In the very early age period, in fact, the 2 languages are pulling apart. The English is growing faster than the Spanish. By 2.5, on average, English and Spanish are growing in parallel. And again, to repeat myself, if you look at the children who are lowest, they are growing faster in English than the children who are higher at 2.5. The next thing that we also saw in the earlier data is if you just look at the bilingual children, so these data are just from the bilingual children, you see that they're growing faster in English than they are in Spanish. So at 2.5 years, they're close to balanced. But by the time they're 5 years old, on average, they are much stronger in English than in Spanish. So if you have to leave now, at least I've told you that don't worry that children are not learning English because they're learning Spanish. That is not the problem. If you are a Spanish speaker trying to raise your child to be bilingual, you should worry that maybe your child isn't going to learn as much Spanish as you would hope for, because it's Spanish that's at risk, not English. Okay. And this is the same sort of analysis we did before. I don't want to take up too much time, but monolinguals are the strongest in English, followed by children who have dominant English exposure, followed by children who have balanced exposure, and the children who are the slowest and the farthest behind in English are the children who hear it the least, and you see the exact same thing for Spanish. So again, to summarize what I've said so far, language acquisition depends on language exposure. This, by the way, is true for monolinguals too. Children who have a richer language environment, who are talked to more, develop their one language faster than children who have an impoverished linguistic environment and who aren't talked to very much. Children with 50% exposure to a language lag behind children who have 100% exposure to that same language. And now what we see really clearly when we extend our range up to 5 years is that even when home language exposure is balanced, heritage language acquisition, that is, the heritage language is Spanish for the families that I study, lags behind host language acquisition. Host language is the term used to describe the language of the country. So for my families, it is English. Okay. Quality of language exposure matters too. It's not just how much you hear, it's the nature of what you hear. And there's one thing about the exposure to English that the children in my study have that monolingual children don't have. And that is they hear the majority of their English from people who are native Spanish speakers. Now, some non-native speakers are highly proficient and they use English as well as I do. But many non-native speakers are not very proficient in English. And when they speak to their children, their English is different. Now, let me show you the pictures that show this. First of all, this is a measure. So this is the whole sample. This is the proportion of children. Sorry, this is on average across all the bilingual children on whom we collected these data. On average, 40% of the English they hear comes from native English speakers. 60% comes from people who are not native speakers. And there are differences. And the differences, I don't want to say, you have to be a native speaker, but many native speakers are not particularly proficient and their speech is different. And let me show you. So this is a measure of the mother's speech. And so we recorded the mothers playing with their children, and we recorded only those mothers who said, yeah, I speak English to my child all the time. So we didn't force people to speak English to their children if it's not something they usually do. We recorded them playing with their children, speaking English, and we counted how long their utterances were, and we counted how many different words they used, so the richness of their vocabulary. And both of these measures, utterance length and vocabulary richness, predict language development in monolingual children. That's been found several times. And if we look, these dark bars are the non-native speakers. No, sorry, other way around. These dark bars are native speakers of English. The middle bars are non-native speakers who describe themselves as having good proficiency. And the light bars are non-native speakers who by their own account are not very proficient in English. Now you might wonder, why are they speaking English to their children if they're not very proficient? And that's another story, or it's another rabbit hole we can go down. But the short answer is somebody told them that they should be speaking English to their children because this is America. And their children will go to school in English, and their children have to learn English, and therefore they must speak English to their children. And it is true they need to learn English, and it is true they will go to school in English, but it's not necessarily a good idea for parents who have very limited proficiency in English to be speaking English to their children. And this is why, if you look at properties of speech to children that are positive influences on children's language development, parents who are speaking a language in which they have low proficiency, their speech is different. Their speech does not have the grammar and the richness of vocabulary that children need to hear to acquire the language. So what happens when parents with very limited proficiency in English speak English to their children is they're not helping their children's English that much. But what they most certainly are doing is hurting their children's Spanish. There's an opportunity cost to using a language that you're not very good in. Your child's not hearing a language that they could be learning. Okay, enough on that topic. One more thing that matters that we have discovered in our studies is that children have to not just hear a language, they also have to speak a language. And this phenomenon was really first identified looking at adolescents and adults in foreign language instruction. So if your high school French lessons were like my high school French lessons, you probably understand a little French, but you'd be pretty scared of speaking it. Well, a similar thing happens to some children in this bilingual environment. And I'll show you the result first, and then I will tell you what we think the cause is. So look over here at this graph. This is the result. These are 115 bilingual children from the same sample that I've been talking about. Over here, we see their measure of English and Spanish comprehension, okay? And they look balanced. That is, if you only measured how well these children understand English and Spanish, you would say these children, on average, are balanced bilinguals. On the other hand, if you measure their expressive language skill, how many different words do they know to say, they're much better in English than in Spanish. How did that come about? And in fact, if I ask the students in my classes, many of whom come from Spanish-speaking homes, but now they're, let's say, 20 years old, and I say, how many of you speak Spanish? The most common answer is, well, I understand it, but I don't really speak it. Now, how can that be? If you're talking about monolinguals, there's no such thing as understanding a language and not speaking it. Okay? There is no normal monolingual development where you only learn to understand and you never speak. But it is a quite frequent outcome in bilingual development, particularly in heritage host bilingual development. And we have evidence that this is the reason why, or at least a good part of the reason why. What bilingual children can do, and do, is if you speak to them in Spanish, so you're a Spanish-speaking mother, you want your child to learn Spanish, you speak to your child in Spanish, and your child answers you in English. And this happens all the time. Parents notice it, parents worry about it, and it does have an effect. What this shows is that these children who you see in this graph, who are balanced in terms of comprehension, they're pretty balanced in terms of what they hear also. Their input is 46% English across the whole sample. But they are not balanced in their language use. So 52% of them will frequently answer in English when spoken to in Spanish. What that means is they, even though they're hearing Spanish about half the time, they're not speaking Spanish about half the time. Now, you do find some children who switch to Spanish when they are addressed in English, but that's a significantly lower number. So what you have is children whose exposure to English and Spanish are balanced, but whose use of English and Spanish is not balanced. It's English dominant. And so you see English dominant expressive skills in the same children who have balanced comprehension skills. Okay. And then the last lesson that I am going to report to you is that the societal context matters. And this particular societal context, even in South Florida, where again, if you get off the plane, as I did as a monolingual speaker of English for your first visit to South Florida, you feel like you're in a Spanish-speaking country, but that's only because you're used to, I was used to Wisconsin, which really isn't a monolingual English place. English dominates outside the home. In fact, we have measures of what these children at the age of 2 hear outside the home. And for all of them, it is English dominant. The only place there is a Spanish dominant environment for children of immigrant families. I know what the mayor said about Hialeah. You can live there and never learn English. But in fact, if you see adult monolingual Spanish speakers, even if you see adult speakers who are much stronger in Spanish than in English, they are almost certainly immigrants. They are not children of immigrants. Children who are born here to Spanish-speaking families end up English dominant. And I'm going to show you that at 5, but it gets stronger and stronger the older the children get. So remember this is the course of English development. This is the course of Spanish development. Now what I'm going to show you is a picture of what English and Spanish look like side by side in the same children. So this is a graph where we put everybody in a matrix as a function of their English vocabulary and Spanish vocabulary. It's the same expressive vocabulary test I've been talking about. So here we have a child who is the best in terms of English. Okay, they have the highest English vocabulary score, and they're also one of the best in terms of Spanish. This child down here has the lowest score in English and in Spanish. So children vary, and they vary, children vary, first point. All children vary in language development, and bilingual children vary in the nature of their bilingual development. You have children who are balanced and low, fairly balanced and high in both. You have some children who are very strong in English and hardly speak Spanish. And you have some children who are better in Spanish than in English. But children are not equally distributed across this whole picture. So this line is the line where everybody would be if they were all balanced bilinguals and only differed in the total vocabulary that they know. Most of this sample at the age of 5 is English dominant. They're on this side of the line. Far, far fewer are on this side of the line. Now, there's something else we can do with this picture, and you can sort of get a hint of it if you look at the different colors and shapes of these dots. This is the result of a statistical procedure called cluster analysis, where we simply ask, are there any groups? You know, if I had made them all the same blue dot, it wouldn't really look, it would look like one giant group. But actually, some points are closer together and some points are farther apart. And we can identify profiles of bilingual skill. And I've drawn circles around the different groups that this statistical procedure identifies. And so this is profile 1 down here, and this is what they look like. The average English vocabulary score, the solid bars are English, the dotted bars are Spanish. Their solid English vocabulary score is about 40. That doesn't mean anything, it's just for comparison purposes. And they are much better in English than they are in Spanish. Then there's another group, this group, that's far more balanced. This is their English, this is their Spanish. Then we have a group that's quite a bit stronger in English, but very English dominant. Their English is way up there, but their Spanish is not so great. Move this. And then we have this group. This is the group that bilingual parents hope their children will be in. This group of children is strong in English and almost as strong in Spanish. This last bar over here is monolinguals, just for the purposes of comparison. And so there's a few things to say about this graph. Let me move. So these different profiles differ on two dimensions. They differ in how dominant versus balanced they are. But when they differ in dominance, they only differ in degree of English dominance. There are some children who are Spanish dominant, but there is no Spanish dominant group. That is not a common outcome of the kind of bilingual experience that children of immigrant families have in the United States. By the age of 5, they end up English dominant. The differences among children are in their total vocabulary and in how English dominant they are. And you can see, and then the second point to make, is there really is not a trade-off between English and Spanish skill. You were probably thinking that when I first started talking, because the kids who hear more English are better in English and worse in Spanish. But that's within how many words they know altogether. Some children know more than others. And what you can see in the data at the age of 5, let's look at this sort of best outcome group. They're a little bit different from they're a little bit below the monolinguals in terms of English, but this is not statistically corrected for level of education and maternal level of education. And maternal education predicts almost everything about child development. So what you can see in this group is their English is really fine and their Spanish is almost as good. These children, their English is fine, but they don't really know much of Spanish. Not knowing Spanish did not help their English. Okay, these two groups are not different in the English. And down here you have children who are not doing as well in terms of total vocabulary, but again, the children who know less Spanish don't necessarily know more English at all. Statistically, there is no correlation between the size of the children's English vocabulary and the size of the children's Spanish vocabulary. What there is a big difference in total vocabulary. And the difference in total vocabulary is much more a function of how much Spanish they know than of how much English they know. To say the same thing in another way, yet children vary in their language learning ability. Monolingual children develop language at different rates. Monolingual children at the age of 5 will differ on exactly this measure that I'm showing you. But in addition to those differences among children that arise from differences in ability, there are differences that arise from experience. And what these data show is that the Spanish experience adds to the English experience. It doesn't take away from it. So the children who are good in Spanish have bigger total vocabularies than the children who are not so good in Spanish. And they don't necessarily have smaller English vocabularies. So to conclude, learning a language depends on the quantity and quality of language exposure. It is normal. It does take longer to learn 2 languages than to learn 1 because the exposure is distributed. For children in Spanish-speaking homes, English learning may additionally be slowed if exposure is provided by speakers with limited proficiency. Now, this next one is something that I didn't really talk about or give you data for, but Spanish growth is inhibited. That is, these children are not learning Spanish as well as they would if they were living in a Spanish-speaking country, because when a language is only used at home, the situations of use also limit the range of vocabulary you use and the complexity of the sentences you use. So it's it's one moral of this story I'm telling you is that it is really a remarkable achievement for bilingual children to have mastered two languages, because the circumstances are not ideal for either language. However, to the extent that you can approach ideal circumstances, if the quantity and the quality of language exposure are maximized, children can become proficient and balanced bilingual. There is nothing in the brain that stops that. To the degree that children don't become proficient and balanced bilinguals, it is because the environment has not provided them with the necessary supports. And on that note, I will say thank you and acknowledge that I did not do this by myself at all. I had many collaborators, including many graduate students at FAU. I had support from many institutions, primarily from the National Institutes of Health. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, Erika. Very interesting. So we do have already a number of questions, but just as a reminder, if you have a question for Dr. Hoff, please type that under the Q&A button. If you hover your mouse on the bottom of your screen, you see a little icon. You click on that and you can type your question there. Okay, so let's get started. So Erika, were any of the children attending daycare or preschool where English was the primary language, and did that impact the results?
Okay. Yes, some of the children were attending daycare and more as they got older, and we have looked at that. In virtually all of the daycare, English was the official language, was the language of curriculum. People who have observed, not my particular participants in the daycares they went to, but people who have studied daycare for Spanish-speaking children in South Florida have observed two things. Many of the daycare workers are native Spanish speakers. For many of them, and I'm not the one who's making this claim or observation, many of them speak English very, very poorly. Daycare work is not well paid. So you tend not to get people with degrees from English-speaking schools. It is a low-paying job for immigrants. And the frustration is they are obliged by the setup of the school to speak English, which they speak badly. And so, of course, they revert to Spanish for many things that are sort of off curriculum. So what happens is the children hear English in school. And again, this is not based on my results. I'm telling you what the literature says about daycare. The children get the curriculum delivered in English by people who don't speak English very well, so the English isn't that helpful to them. And when it comes time to, put on your boots, put on your sweater, go to the bathroom, that kind of behavior management is done in Spanish. Mm-hmm. And they're native speakers of Spanish, but they're using a very limited vocabulary. So the input is not very good for either English or Spanish. And we have looked at the environment and the effect of daycare attendance. Again, this is on average. There can be wonderful, wonderful daycares, and they do it is certainly possible for daycare experience to make a big difference in children's development. But if we look on average, even at the experience of these fairly advantaged children, the number of hours they spend in daycare, because it's different for different children, and the age at which they started daycare is different for different children, makes no difference to their English language development. Now, we don't have the most sensitive measures, so I'm not saying you couldn't find effects if you had a more sensitive way of looking for it. But here's another thing that we find in, again, our fairly advantaged families. In the second sample, where we had a fairly big range, we asked the mothers what's the native language of your child's primary daycare teacher? And we think parents can tell that. And it was overwhelmingly Spanish, but more so for the lower income families than the higher income families. And the lower income families are also less proficient in English themselves. So the children who need English input the most from daycare because their parents do not speak English well are the children who are least likely to get it.
Great. Very interesting study. Okay, and slightly different question, Erika. What do we know about the ability to assess and differentiate among children who are special or autistic or have SLD? Have studies been done with children who have, some special abilities or autistic?
Yes, I'm not particularly expert in it. It's a fairly recent literature looking at, excuse me, bilingual development in children with autism, because they are now a large group that is getting studied. There are also a lot of studies of bilingual children with language impairment, primary language impairment. Other disabilities, less so. And the literature on children with primary language impairment basically says, yes, if a child is language impaired and bilingual, they will be language impaired in both languages. But you don't see, they're not in double jeopardy. I really can't tell you the results of the research on children with bilingual children with autism. I'm just not up to date on that. But there is an argument I have heard from many sources, and that is, it is some people's intuition that if a child has an impairment of any sort, primary language impairment, autism, whatever, then at least make their life easier and don't expose them to two languages. The people who do this work and who know what they're talking about say that is not the right approach. And the reason is that, if I had a child with autism, I shouldn't send him for Mandarin lessons. Why? But for these bilingual families, the language serves a real communicative function. Mm-hmm. And, it's hard enough having autism without also not being able to talk to your grandmother at all. So to treat the language as just sort of like violin lessons, nice and extra for people who have the time and ability, it is a wrong approach. Language serves real functions in the household. And if a family is using Spanish, there's a reason. And you wouldn't want to deprive a child of access to the family members that you get if you speak their language.
That's actually a really good point, Erika. The purpose behind having a second language versus just learning a second language, I don't know, if because the school requires it, right, or because you like to learn languages, right? Yeah. That's a very different approach behind it, I think. Okay, a couple more questions before we run out of time here. Have there been any studies, I guess, with older children who then move on to a bilingual school? Will they be primarily proficient in both languages?
They will be much better.
Mm-hmm.
And it is I would say it's necessary, but not sufficient. That is, if you never go to school in a language, no matter how much you hear it at home, you are not going to have the same level of proficiency as someone who goes to school in a language. So you cannot expect, and I think some people are doomed to disappointment. But if they think that, well, I'll just speak Spanish at home and my child will become bilingual, the child is not going to become a balanced, bilingual if they go to school in English and they only hear Spanish at home. And people talk about, the employment opportunities of being bilingual. Well, yeah, you can probably work retail, but are you going to be able to write business letters and read briefs and sign and read contracts in a language that you've only used at home with your mother? Of course not.
Right.
But when people have studied what happens when children go to a bilingual school, and the place they have studied this the most is in Canada, where families that only speak English at home, the children are now obliged to go to school and learn French. And what's interesting is their parents who only speak English think they have bilingual children because their children really do speak French. Their children can speak French. But if you test them, their French is not as good as the French of children from French-speaking homes, and their French is not as good as their English. I mean, learning a language sort of never ends, and everything you do in that language contributes to your proficiency in that language. So if experience is less, then proficiency will be less, which is not to say you shouldn't do it. It's great to be able to speak another language, even if you speak, your first and native language better. It's not an argument against being able to speak a language, a second language, but it is an argument against unrealistic expectations.
I must actually agree with you. I'm a non-native English speaker myself, even though I did not grow up bilingual. And I must say, practice. There's a lot of practice to do with learning a language.
It's interesting. Some of the things that I say about sort of the challenge, it's both the challenges and the remarkable accomplishment of being bilingual. It's a harder sell. This argument I'm making is a harder sell in the United States to monolingual audiences. When I give lectures and teach classes in Europe where everybody is bilingual, they all know that it is harder. It takes longer to do things in a language that is not their dominant language.
Yeah. Okay, we're almost out of time. Let me finish up with one more question. I know we have a lot more questions still here, and a lot of them are quite extensive. So Erika, we're going to ask you after the presentation is over to please address these, and we will post the answers on our website. So please look out for that. We want to get your questions answered. So the last one actually comes from, I guess, a student here who wants to know if your lab is accepting applications from undergraduates.
Sure. Send me an email and we'll talk about when to meet.
Great. Excellent. So Erika, thank you very much. I really appreciate your time. As I said, we have a number of more questions, so we will address all of them, or Dr. Hoff will address all of them, and we will post the answers on our website. So please look out for them. The recording of this presentation will be available as well in a couple of days. With that, thank you very much. Our next Research in Action is actually in 2 weeks. If you are a regular, you may remember Michael Dedano. He will be this time talking about the fountain of youth and whether it really exists. All right, with that, I hope everybody has a great rest of your day. Thank you very much.
Thank you.